All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I'm Marco, those of you that don't know me, one of the organizers of APRA. And so tonight we have a lecture by Dr. Christian Greer. And so thank you, Christian, for doing this for us. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And Christian has studied in Amsterdam for quite some time. He got his PhD in Western esotericism from the UvA, and also his master's degree from the UvA and from Harvard. And now he's a visiting scholar in Harvard. And so, yeah, he's gonna tell us about his own research. And yeah, why don't you go ahead, Christian? And thanks again for doing this.
Absolutely, Marco. And I'll share my screen here. And I should start by saying just how thankful I am that I was invited here with all my friends at APRA. It's been a long time coming. Months and months and months. We've bounced emails back and forth. In fact, I think I was supposed to do this lecture like a year ago. But, you know, some minor things have happened in the meantime. Maybe you've heard of it. Anyways, I'm so glad that we finally got together and I can present some of my research. As you see on the title screen here, I will be talking about angel-headed hipsters, psychedelic militancy in 1980s North America. My name is Dr. J. Christian Greer, currently at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. And there you will see my email and Instagram handle. So hit me up on either if you're interested in this stuff, or if you're researching it, or if you just find this fascinating material. I'll have this information available on the last slide, so no need to scribble it down now. Right, well, let's jump into it. The subject of this presentation is an influential yet understudied tradition of alternative spirituality in which psychedelic substances are used sacramentally. They're used as the key to higher knowledge, or gnosis. The principal psychedelic sacrament I will be addressing in this talk is lysergic acid dithalamide, LSD. Now, to be even more specific, today's talk will focus on the movement of spiritual fellowships that projected the discourse of consciousness expansion on drugs, which were used in a ritual setting. Now, I'll come back to what I mean by that, but it's just important to wrap our minds around the fact that you have these substances, and then you have an interpretation projected onto them, the psychedelic interpretation of the effects generated by these substances. Now, there's other interpretations that will be projected on those, but we're not going to look at those. We're just going to be looking at the psychedelic interpretation. And the tradition of which this interpretation has been projected onto these substances represents a movement of churches. And these churches have been understudied, but they've existed more or less since 1955 to the present. So it's an understudied tradition of churches that we're going to look at today. So let's get to the first slide. Here's my argument in a nutshell. I argue that the neglect of psychedelic churches within the scholarly discourse is a product of the war on drugs. The war on drugs, of course, was an international government program that has misshaped the public and scholarly perception of psychedelics and the mind expansion discourse in general. Now, this presentation is broken into two parts. First part, I'm going to put my finger on some of the strategies used by drug war, the people who created the drug war, some of the strategies they use to marginalize any discussion on this tradition of churches. The second part, which I promise is a lot more colorful, I'll actually jump into some of the churches, particularly the most influential of the 1980s. I'm going to give a sort of topographical view of these churches and the milieu that they circulated within. Okay. Also, keep in mind, along the way, I'm going to be planting flags in the ground. I'm going to be planting flags where I think a great deal more research can be done by scholars in the humanities to elaborate the psychedelic worldview and the culture within which that was developed. So let's start with some basics. Whoa, watch out. Right, so this is some background. The term psychedelic was introduced by the English psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond in a letter to his friend Aldous Huxley. That letter was sent in 1956. You probably know this already. Psychedelic can be broken into two terms, both Greek, psyche, which translates to mind or soul, delos, to reveal. So to reveal the soul, to reveal the mind. And it's interesting, we can put our finger on something right now. Psyche, do we translate it as soul or do we translate it as mind? Well, according to the ideology, remember the psychedelic worldview is an ideology. According to this ideology, we're going to translate it as mind. And I'll get back to that. But here, I just want to indicate the substances most commonly associated with the psychedelic ideology would be psilocybin, which is the magic ingredient in magic mushrooms, mescaline, which is the active ingredient in peyote, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and LSD. Of course, there are many, many more. But these are the big ones. Finally, I would like to return to this idea that you have these substances, these molecules, these tryptamines, that cause major changes in the brain, and that these major changes in the brain have been interpreted by a movement of spiritual seekers as the key to mystical awareness. Now, let's also keep in mind that there are other ideologies that would interpret these changes of consciousness differently. Just to give you an idea, you have the psychomimetic interpretation, which was born within the medical establishment, that suggests that these mystical states of consciousness are not mystical at all, but rather delusional, and in fact, they're more of a resemblance to mental illness. Okay, we're not going to talk about that. We're talking about the psychedelic one, which functions, which really suggests that these substances expand consciousness, giving you gnosis, giving you mystical understanding. Now, that is the ideology. Let's go to the movement. Aha, here we go. You might know some of these figures: Aldous Huxley, Gerald Heard, Ken Kesey, John St. Clair, Alan Watts. These are the most famous figures in the tradition of psychedelic spirituality. In fact, they loom larger than life. In fact, they loom too large, if you ask me. There is, in fact, a master narrative about psychedelic culture that has been crafted around these figures. Now, what do they have in common? They're all white men. They're all white men that worked in the 1960s. Okay, here I'm planting my first flag, so as to note that there is much, much, much more work to be done to undermine this master narrative, which is reductive. There's much more work to be done in recognizing the contributions of women, trans people, the LGBT community, Asian Americans, as well as people of color in this tradition of spiritual seeking. Now, I won't get into this elaboration, this more full narrative that needs to be created, but I just wanted to point in that direction here. We could look at some of these figures that could be used to elaborate on the master narrative of psychedelic culture. We have Jimi Hendrix, of course, probably the most recognizable representative of African-American psychedelicism, which is a very prominent tradition that goes all the way to the present. In fact, if you look on the right of the screen, you'll see Kalindi E., a very powerful speaker, very keen student of the psychedelic mysteries, who we have unfortunately lost during the COVID-19 pandemic. If we look here, we also see Anita Hoffman, Diana de Prima, Diana de Prima, of course, the beatnik poet, in my opinion, who was there from the start, not only mixing with the beats in Greenwich Village, but also maturing into a matriarchal position within the psychedelic world. Let's not forget, she was the woman, the high priestess that Leary selected to hold the sacramental acid at his Millbrook commune. So played a very important role that has not been recognized. We have Bishop Itkin, who represents really one of the founding figures in gay psychedelicism, a tradition that would also include the radical fairies. Laura Huxley. So here, be careful. This is not Aldous Huxley's wife. I like to suggest her importance by saying Aldous Huxley is her husband. You know what I mean? Laura Huxley was an influential figure on Aldous's thinking, though not commonly recognized. And finally, we have Lenny St. Clair and Jeannie Parker, the women of the White Panther Party, who really took a forward position shaping the culture of psychedelics in the Midwest. If you're interested, in fact, I have just conducted an interview with Lenny St. Clair and Jeannie Parker that can be viewed on the Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School website. So if you're interested, go to that website, check out my interview with them, because I think we do elaborate a more full narrative on psychedelic culture and who participated in it. Right, so let's move to the psychedelic church movement. And this is just the movement in the 60s, of course. I'll be talking about this movement in later generations, but let's just get a grounding. The term psychedelic church movement may not be immediately familiar, even to scholars of post-war American religion, even to scholars that focus their whole career on this time period. Well, I use the term psychedelic church movement deliberately as an attempt to reappraise these groups that have been otherwise dismissed or marginalized as invented religions, as drug religions, or love cults, or acid fascists, or simply hippie bullshit. It seems to be a popular way to dismiss these ideas and these religions. Now, those terms are, of course, emotionally overloaded, and they ultimately distract scholars from studying these particular groups empirically. And let's not forget, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these groups that remain to be studied that no one has looked at. So really, it's an exciting time to be in the humanities looking at this particular subject because it's an open frontier. Now, to be clear, each of these groups suggested their own psychedelic ideology. You could think of them as sects, and each one of them has their own ideology, and along with that ideology, they have a ritual container. They have an idea how these ideologies should be put into practice ritually. Okay, and we see a lot of them, and more or less, we can put these psychedelic churches on a spectrum. On one end, you have the merry pranksters that represent the demotic ritual mode, as though to say the best way to take psychedelics, the way to maximize the healing, mystical, sensual, and beneficial aspects of psychedelic consciousness is to totally freak out, to take these substances in what they would call the acid test or the be-in. This is a no structure, rock and roll music. You got body paint, you got dancing, strobe lights, maybe even a concession stand, get some French fries, everything all at once, no structure. And that allows you to really come into yourself by going out of yourself. It's an ecstatic mode. Now on the other end, here we have the demotic mode. Here on the other end, we have the liturgical ritualists of the League of Spiritual Discovery. That's Tim Leary's group. League of Spiritual Discovery. Maybe you get it, LSD. And the League of Spiritual Discovery, representing the other end, insisted on what they call smells and bells. You know, you had your ritual, you had your books, the Psychedelic Experience, very famous guidebook. So they were very much modeling themselves on a church. Oh, and to be more specific, a Protestant style church ceremony. No, actually more of a Catholic, now that you think about it, because you would have a sacrament, you would have vestments, so actually more of a Catholic view. And let's not forget Timothy Leary himself was Catholic. I just want to make one more point here. As I move forward in this talk, I will not be using the term psychedelic. In my view, the term psychedelic has become overburdened with meaning. In fact, I will use the term psychedelicist and psychedelicism so as to indicate I'm talking about a spiritual ideology and not, for example, this expanded field of like tie-dye, love beads, records, and commercial bric-a-brac often associated with the hippies. So psychedelicist is a specific term I'll be using to indicate the beliefs of the psychedelic church movement, not all of this consumer garbage. Okay. So we've looked at some of the main psychedelicists. We've tried to expand our view of what they could include. Then we've looked at the organization they formed in the 1960s. Now, what happened after the 60s? Well, scholars tend to present the 1960s as the apex of psychedelic religion, as the height of psychedelic enthusiasm, and then poof, magically, once the clock turned over to 1970s, the carriage turned into a pumpkin, the horses turned into mice. You know, no, that didn't happen. But scholars have presented the psychedelic revolution of the 1960s as a chronotrope, as a time-limited phenomenon. Of course, it's not. In fact, the 1960s psychedelicist milieu was the nucleation point for a tradition that, in fact, expanded and diversified in the decades that followed. So while the story of psychedelic culture has been the story of psychedelic culture in the 60s has been written and rewritten and rewritten and studied in depth, there is a stark lack of focus on this movement in the decades following it. Now, I would like to plant my second flag here and just really emphasize how psychedelic culture in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s is a wide open field of research, so much to look at, and I think is going to represent a really a turning point in the way in which we understand psychedelic culture in general. So totally open field for scholars in the humanities. Now there's two way markers that I would like to draw your attention to when it comes to opening up the study of psychedelic culture after the 60s. The first is my friend Eric Davis's High Weirdness. The text came out in 2019, and it really does offer a solid basis for understanding the massification of psychedelic use after the 1960s. If we want to understand what happened after the 1960s, Davis's book is fantastic because it looks specifically at the 1970s. His object of focus is psychedelic culture in the 1970s. So it's a perfect place to really found this new trajectory in the study of psychedelic culture. Okay, so Eric has the 70s. The 80s, nothing, really, you're on your own. And for example, when I was conducting my research on this period for my dissertation, I discovered a second wave of psychedelic enthusiasm, even larger than the first in the 1960s, crashed in the 1980s. What? Psychedelics were even bigger in the 80s than they were in the 60s? That's just an indication of what remains to be discovered as scholars start to look at this particular tradition moving beyond the 60s. Now, to be sure, the institutionalization of psychedelic enthusiasm after the 60s took on a variety of forms. And this diversification was accompanied by a broadening of the psychedelicist worldview. So in addition to the expansion of consciousness and the Eastern ideas that really were front and center in the 1960s, in the 70s and 80s, you see a whole host of other cultic ideas, conspiracy theories, UFO cosmologies, anti-authoritarian, anarchist, and socialist politics, esoteric spirituality, human potential therapies, radical environmentalism, and digital utopianism. Now, this broadening of interest was very much a political expediency, because openly advocating psychedelic mysticism itself became too dangerous after President Nixon inaugurated the war on drugs in 1968. Of course, President Nixon founding the war on drugs, this war on drugs bureaucracy would only become more bloated and powerful in the years and decades that followed. So I will return to the boom in psychedelics in the 1980s shortly. Excuse me. Here, I would like to emphasize why there's so little research on the 70s and 80s. Really, it's hard to overestimate the damage done by the war on drugs. Though here's a telling statistic. Drug-related arrests and convictions exceeded any other type of crime in the United States in the 1980s. Shocking. To be sure, this mass governmental program had a detrimental effect on the scholarship in psychedelic culture. Now, if one considers the extensive condemnation of psychedelics by governmental authorities, cultural bodies over the last 70 years, it's not hard to understand why scholars would avoid the topic. It's pretty hard to get tenure if you are researching something that is universally condemned, both for moral and legal reasons. So reflecting on the prejudices that scholars of psychedelic culture have faced, Dr. Walter Hennegraaff has noted, quote, "It's always easy for critics to suggest that their scholarly arguments are just a front for some personal agenda of pro-psychedelic apologetics." That is, the opponents of those of us who study psychedelic culture can always accuse us of having a secret agenda of wanting everyone to take drugs. Or in fact, it's not the case at all. You can be a scholar of anything and not necessarily promote the thing you're studying. So on one hand, we have the suspicion that scholars of psychedelic spirituality are secretly promoting dangerous drugs. However, there's a paradox here, because on the other hand, it's also commonly believed that psychedelics and the alteration of consciousness that they create are unworthy of study by historians and cultural theorists and scholars of religion. So, as you may know, the academic study of psychedelicism is haunted by this religionist assumption that chemically induced alteration of consciousness are inauthentic. This idea was introduced a long time ago in the 1950s by an Oxford Don named Marcy Zaner, but the idea has stayed the same since the 50s. That is, genuine mystical experiences have nothing to do with drugs. Now, of course, that is not an objective point of view. There's no way to measure an authentic religious experience. We don't have an authentic ometer that we could measure these things with. This is an ideological point that to this day dominates across so many of the scholarly disciplines. So these are the two reasons that, oh, you shouldn't study drugs because you have a secret agenda, but even if you did, it wouldn't be important because they're not real. Okay, something's going on there. Now, I want to add one more factor. More to the point here is the belief that psychedelics are in no way connected to authentic religious experience. That idea has informed judicial policy since the late 1960s. Here, I'd like to look into that legal idea very briefly. War on drugs as a regime of truth. The drug war was not simply a militarized police force and judiciary predisposed to disproportionately imprisoning people of color. It was also a propaganda campaign concocted to manage perception of psychedelics through school programs, popular entertainment, medical associations, pharmaceutical consortiums, and the juridical system at large. By exercising epistemological control, that is to say, by creating the circumstances by which things can be known, the drug war shaped the entire discussion around drugs. And of course, how did they shape it? They silenced it. So here I would like to plant my third flag so as to signal that describing the tradition of psychedelicism over the last 70 years, in my opinion, is actually, so describing the churches and the people and the places and the events is actually less important than elaborating the ways in which this really interesting history has been written out of the history books. What mechanisms have been at play? Now, I'm not going to go through all these mechanisms. I'm just going to point to one that's, what do you say, a hot take, okay? This is my hottest take when it comes to these mechanisms of exclusion. The term psychedelic renaissance, it's something we hear every day. It's on the news media, in books, articles. No one takes it for granted. It's the psychedelic renaissance. But I take it for granted. That's right. The term psychedelic renaissance is itself an artifact of the drug war, or what I call the drug war epistemology. By presupposing that psychedelic research ended magically in the 1960s, the term psychedelic renaissance legitimizes the historical redaction of psychedelic research over the last 70 years. I mean, let's think about this. Etymologically, renaissance means to be reborn. But how can something that never died be reborn? You see, by using the term psychedelic renaissance, we forcefully forget that this tradition has expanded and diversified over the last 70 years. So, let me put this in radical terms. Those who use the idea psychedelic renaissance are in fact suffering from an intellectual hangover from the extremely powerful policy of exclusion that has marginalized the homegrown tradition of psychedelic research and mysticism that was driven underground by the drug war inquisition. All right, let me summarize this first part of my talk, and then we can move on to the second part, which I said is a little bit more colorful. So, summarizing here, the drug war was a regime of truth that distorted the academic study of psychedelicist religions. And in order to get beyond this epistemology, we have to dismantle some of the taken for granted concepts that we use when we talk about psychedelic culture. The one I've identified today is psychedelic renaissance, but there are many, many more. Hippie, one of my least. Recreational marijuana, another one. There are many. And in order to get behind this epistemology, we need a new framework. And I believe that we could substantiate that new framework by using different terms: psychedelicist, psychedelicism, psychedelicist church movement. And to tell you the truth, the history, the new history, the new historiography of psychedelicism is still in its infancy. And I really look forward to developing it, not just in the lecture program I'm co-coordinating, Psychedelics and the Future of Religion here at the Center for the Study of Religion, but also with all of you and my new friends at ARPA. So this is why I think the time is ripe for collaboration on this material. Okay, let's jump into the second part. Boop. Okay, let me begin my discussion of my dissertation here. Angel-headed hipsters. Wait, I don't know if you can see me, but anyways, angel-headed hipsters, psychedelic militancy in 1980s North America. Let me begin my discussion by laying out my agenda as a historian in the clearest possible terms, okay? History is not fixed. Rather, it can and should be renewed through the recovery of voices that have been marginalized. So, my dissertation on fanzines in the 1980s was staged as an intervention on behalf of primary sources that are both marginal and ephemeral. At the heart of my dissertation then, Angel-headed hipsters, is the claim that our picture of the US in the 1980s is incomplete. And this assertion, strong assertion, is based on a discovery. In fact, more than a mere discovery, I happened upon a lost continent of primary sources that have not been accounted for in the historical record. Enter the zine scene. Right. The zine scene was an alternative communications microcosm that was international in scope. Participatory and decentralized, this penumbral area of culture encompassed the exchange of lots of stuff: homemade artwork, poems, self-recorded music, amateur video, alternative pornography, and handwritten novels. Literally handwritten novels, mimeograph. That said, the coin of the realm in this bohemian republic of arts and letters was the homemade fan magazine, the zine, fanzine. Uncommercial, non-professional, uncensored, and distributed in extremely small numbers. These homemade magazines were easy and cheap to make, thanks to breakthroughs in photocopier technology. Also, the Postal Service made them extremely affordable to send out. So tens of thousands of fanzines circulated each year between 1985 and 1995. So to put this discovery into perspective, and here I'm exaggerating a little bit, imagine writing a history of the last 20 years without mentioning social media. Okay, now while the zine scene admittedly involved dramatically fewer people, its significance as a communications network still can't be ignored. So as an empiricist, I was bowled over by the fact that such an astonishingly vast archive of vernacular culture even existed. And it appeared all the more significant to me because this material had only been studied by about 4 sociologists. So the question is, what happened in this alternative public sphere? It took me about 3.5 years to read over much of this material. And I should say that fanzines are not held in libraries or sold in stores. In fact, they were defined by their rejection of that type of consumer relationship. So when I said, oh, it took me about 3 years to read through all this stuff, of course I didn't read all the zines in the zine scene. What I did was I was able to accumulate a few different zines, and then I'd go to the back and try to find a P.O. box, and I'd send a letter to that P.O. box. Maybe I'd hear back, maybe not. And when I did, I'd ask, well, do you know anybody else who's still around? Oh yeah, you got to talk to my friend. And it was what sociologists call a snowball technique, but it was really an adventure. It's really why I got into academics in the first place. This idea of discovery and Indiana Jones style exploration. And I made a lot of friends, which is really cool. Right, so fanzines. Fanzines are an unmediated vox populi, a voice of the people that was unencumbered by censors, good taste, or even legality. And compared to the recording the reporting broadcast by corporate-owned TV, radio, and newspaper, the information conveyed in zines seems to have come from a different country or even a different planet. But it didn't. Fanzines reflected the world we live in, but have been conditioned not to see. Here we get back to that epistemological point. Once we look beyond this epistemology and start searching out this alternative public sphere, we come to what I like to think of as a cheap truth. Psychedelics never went away. In fact, it became a bigger cultural phenomenon after the 60s. So my job as a historian is to reveal what we have been conditioned not to see, and likewise to explain how mundane, everyday practices are made to be unrecognizable. So the vernacular religion within the zine scene was the religious use of mind-altering drugs, and principally LSD, psilocybin, and cannabis. In fact, the zine scene was the home to the psychedelicist church movement. For context, the psychedelic strain of esotericism, as I mentioned, was driven underground by President Richard Nixon's declared war on drugs, and the subsequent decades of prohibition and inquisition created a repressive intellectual atmosphere where the evangelists of psychedelic spirituality were forced to occupy and create alternative networks. I coined the term psychedelicism to describe the ongoing social mobilization of spiritual seekers who glorified psychedelic drugs as the key to spiritual understanding, and not all of the mass commercialization of hip culture that preceded the 1960s. So in a sense, my work on psychedelicism filled a blind spot that a lot of scholars have really identified but not addressed in their research. Yes, we know psychedelic cultures were around in the 80s. Yes, we know the massification of psychedelics proceeded into the 1970s. We know they didn't go away. In fact, we know that they saturated middle-class America and upper-class America, but we just don't know the scale, the networks, or the participants involved. Well, my research addressed that in particular, the scale, the networks, and the participants involved. Yet identifying fanzines as the channel through which psychedelic spirituality was transmitted is insufficient, in my view. Let's be more daring, and let's interrogate the profusion of psychedelicism within fanzines. In other words, why were there so many acid heads in the zine scene? Well, let's look here. Some background information. The failure of mainstream religion to halt the succession of world wars that consumed the first half of the 20th century had a detrimental effect on the credibility of mainstream religion. People were looking for alternatives. And this credibility gap inspired a new religious ethic amongst Bohemians, hip. Now, being hip did not necessarily mean adhering to certain beliefs. It was a way beliefs were held. It was swinging with it, being at one with the universe, or as Ram Dass said, be here now, present-mindedness, awareness. It was an asymmetrical consciousness, a religious logic that served as a way of life for a new cultural archetype, the hipster. As you may well know, the hipsters of the 1950s begot another generation, the 1960s hippies. Though that's a media-created term that I think is best abandoned, let's call them psychedelicists. Now, in sum, hip represented a reconfiguration of holiness. To be sure, the psychedelic movement did not magically evaporate at the end of 1969. On the contrary, psychedelicism did not dissolve at all. Rather, it underwent a process of diffusion. By the mid-1970s, fashion designers, record companies, film studios, and advertisers had totally commodified the hip ideals of psychedelicism. Really, it's the only way to explain the fashion logic governing these advertisements, I think. And by way of the culture industry's co-optation of psychedelicism, we had the creation of a new paradigm of hyperconsumption. No longer would the commercial markets be dominated by reliable products, dependability. No. Now, in this hyper-consumption age, all consumer projects must reflect authenticity, spontaneity, self-expression, and rebellion. These were now the values of a psychedelicized advertising industry. These were the hallmarks of authenticity. Hip culture had, as one scholar noticed, by the 1970s, relocated from the periphery to the center of the nation's consciousness. This was later termed the tyranny of hip, which we all must suffer under these days. However, this appropriation of hip ideals did not go uncontested. A rebellion was launched. Psychedelicist militants established a new bastion for authentic authenticity beyond the purview of the capitalist and co-opters and consumerist masses. This was the zine scene. Zines were authentic. They were a realm of vernacular holiness outside the manufactured consent of the media spectacle. To be certain, the zine scene microcosm did not speak with one voice, and that is precisely its value. Fanzines spoke the polyglot language of folk America, an esoteric lexicon of exiled fantasies, wild ideas, illicit dreams, and rejected knowledge. Here, on the frontier of self-expression, psychedelicist churches thrived like exotic flowers in the rainforest. I would just like to introduce you to some of the key psychedelicist churches of the 1980s and their role in constructing the zine scene. The largest psychedelic sect in American history, no question, is the Church of the Subgenius, founded in 1979/1980. It would attract thousands of followers from the 1980s to today, and it's still going on today, and it's still a very fun thing with radio shows and films. Actually, a new film was just released, a new documentary on them, and annual events. And they're still doing very well, and you could attend Subgenius things if you wanted. Now, the church, formed in the late 70s, was intentionally created to act as a big tent for like-minded seekers who had found themselves throughout the 1970s exiled, at least intellectually, by the war on drugs. Their idea is we want to bring everyone home once more, no longer diffuse within culture, bring them home into one big tent church. Now, by doing that, they thought, no, how are we going to do that? How are we going to bring everyone under one canopy? Fanzines. So they stimulated a major upwelling of enthusiasm, absorbing the personnel and beliefs of the alternative spiritual milieu by circulating homemade magazines across discrete subcultures. Science fiction fandom, avant-garde art, anti-music, monster films, you name it, they had an interest in bringing together everyone into one mega milieu. As more subcultural networks appropriated the practice of making and exchanging fan-made magazines, the Subgenius newsletter, the Stark Fist of Removal, became the central hub for rejuvenated culture of psychedelic experimentation. Now I'd like to pivot to Discordianism. Actually, I was very happy to hear, my friend Cece just told me, Adam Curtis has just released a new documentary, Can't Get You Out of My Mind, that focuses on Discordianism. How cool is that? Adam Curtis is one of my favorite filmmakers, fantastic documentary filmmaker, and he has absorbed he's recognized the influence of Discordianism. How cool. Well, Discordianism itself, I'll make it brief, founded in 1958, Whittier, California. Really founded in 58, this is the psychedelic church that carried the torch for psychedelicist militancy throughout the 1970s, throughout the heavy years of the war on drugs. Now, its safety was ensured by the fact that it instructed its members never to join together. In fact, the Subgenius slogan is, Discordians stick apart. Not stick together, they stick apart. And they say, we're not a religion, we're an irreligious, we're not a religious organization, we're an irreligious disorganization. The idea, actually, if you're interested in this, I have an article on my academia.edu page called Discordians Stick Apart. It goes through the history of Discordians. It's a fascinating group, but they formed as a counterbalance to the CIA and FBI. They saw the government intelligence agencies as a model for psychedelicists to structure themselves around to engage in battle. And instead of violence, they mobilized the forces of chaos and disorganization, discord, and confusion. Discordianism, of course, is named after the Greek god Ares, Discordia, the goddess of chaos. And really, having been dispersed in every subculture throughout the 1970s, it was in the 1980s that the Church of the Subgenius created a milieu and thereby absorbed the energies of Discordianism into a new psychedelic movement. Some of the chief Discordians that would join the Subgenius Church, its founders, Kerry Thornley and Greg Hill, as well as its chief exponents, Robert Che and Robert Anton Wilson. You would have them all conglomerate together in the zine scene of the 1980s. The final group I want to mention is the Moorish Orthodox Church of America, which was similarly formed in the early 60s in and around Columbia University in New York City. What made this group different? It was a psychedelic church, you know, same as the ones I showed earlier. What made it different was its membership was composed of the only white members of Noble Drew Ali's Moorish science movement. So this was an all-black movement. Noble Drew is looked at as the father of Black Islam. He started the Moorish science movement in the first decades of the 20th century. And as it grew, one really exceptional grouplet formed within the Moorish movement, and that were these angel-headed hipsters. That were these psychedelic hipsters that totally adopted Drew Ali's teachings, but changed them in a way that made them psychedelic, esoteric, and sexual liberationist. The Moorish Orthodox Church of America actually moved in to Leary's Lysergic Seminary in Millbrook. They were there for a while, and then disbanded or went underground through the 1970s, like so many other groups did, and really reemerged in the 1980s as a potent force within the zine scene, thanks largely to one figure, Hakim Bey, a very mysterious propagandist, who would introduce the idea of the temporary autonomous zone, the TAZ. And this idea would really be very influential, very important for many of the in-person activities of radicals in the 1980s and 90s. The temporary autonomous zone was the intellectual framework out of which different cultural radicals, for example, launched the rave scene of the 1990s, the squatting movement in Amsterdam. You'll find copies, Dutch copies of temporary autonomous zone scattered throughout squats and anarchist libraries in Amsterdam to this day. And finally, Burning Man. The creators of Burning Man were very inspired by this idea of a temporary autonomous zone. Okay, so that was some of the main key players in the zine scene. Now let's wrap it up, huh? Arguing that the connections between drugs and religion have deep historical roots in human culture, my work focuses on the psychedelicist claim that mind-altering substances place them in communion with the sacred. Informed by a materialist study of religion, my work also examines the clandestine social networks built by psychedelicists in response to the criminalization of their devotional practices in the late 60s. As a result of government persecution, the allied forces of psychedelicist militancy fomented the rise of fanzine culture. And this was an alternative communications microcosm based on participatory, decentralized exchange of homemade artworks, publications, music, and cassette tapes. So my work is a historiographic intervention on behalf of material culture that recovers the lost story of a persecuted spiritual minority, as well as our own collective history. And with that, I'll draw my talk to a close. Thank you for your attention. I'll stop sharing my screen here. Oh, thank you for your clapping.
All right. Thank you, Christian. Thank you very much for the talk. I thought it was very interesting. And now we could have some questions if you want.
I would love that. Yes. This is the most exciting part, of course.
Okay. So anyone, I think you can raise your hand or just start talking if you want to ask a question. Go ahead.
I suppose isn't it customary for the members, the organizers, to get the first shot to throw the first ball at the clown in the dunk tank. So
Yeah,
right.
I have some questions.
So if no one from the audience does.
So again, yeah, very interesting, and definitely I agree with, you know, the fact that, yeah, if you look at culture as a whole, not just, let's say, science or academia, the psychedelic movement, they never really went away, as you were saying. If anything, it got bigger, with a lot of things that have been super influential in culture, as you were mentioning, the things like Burning Man, or even as you were saying, the raves, the rave scene. And so you see really a continuation in that through those structures, let's say, of what happened before. And it's definitely something that is not talked about that much. And the other thing I want to ask you maybe more about the term psychedelic renaissance, and if you think it's a term that shouldn't be used, or should be used, or applies or doesn't apply. I can tell you what I mean by it, because I've used it generally. And generally, I just mean that, you know, if you look at the number of papers, for example, with the words of like psilocybin or LSD over time, like in the 20th century, you see them going up a bit in like the 40s and 50s and the 60s, and then the war on drugs happens and it starts to go down. And then you see that in the last 10, 15 years, it starts going up again by a lot. So I think when I use the term psychedelic renaissance, that's what I meant, like a description of that, basically, the fact that, yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I just want to be very clear. Psychedelic renaissance is misleading insofar as research into scientific research, hard scientific research into psychedelic substances has never dropped. That too, along with the cultural element, has always been going on underground. And by calling it a psychedelic renaissance, my friends over at Peace Symposium do a lot of great stuff with this. The researchers hard at work on all of this stuff have been erased from cultural memory. And so now what we have is not a renaissance, nothing's being reborn. We have a, how do I put this in polite terms, a corporatization of the research that was done out of love and respect for these chemicals, now being ruthlessly, what is that, copywritten, and there is a marketization going on. And psychedelic renaissance is the motto, the tagline, the Mickey Mouse, so to speak, of this particular moment in the history of psychedelics. So that's why I prefer to call it the corporatization of psychedelics, or the marketization, because the research itself has always been going on, scientific research, and we know why it hasn't been mentioned. You're talking about the Ngram in Google, why we don't see it mentioned so much? Yeah, well, they'd be arrested and flogged and put in shackles. You know, that's what it's.
Yes, but that's kind of what it refers to, I guess, that it was that there were obstacles in the way of research, let's say, for a long time, that are now a bit, to some extent, removed, not far from. But I fully agree with you that also the commercialization thing is one thing that is going on. The marketization of psychedelics is definitely like going on, and I think it's something that, you know, we're a non-profit, and like and people that are in academia in general have concerns about. But I think also just in within science and within academia, there has been if you can call it another, like an increase, the second increase of interest, let's say, like towards psychedelics from scientists and academics, which I don't think it's completely identical to the commercialization aspect. I think like they are intertwined. Obviously, they're not independent, but they're also not. I don't think they're exactly like the same thing. But I get what you're saying, that it's been co-opted, kind of the term, let's say, by the commercialized aspect. So that has makes it a bit more undesirable. But I don't know. I guess when I use it, I try to reclaim it for the scientific part, let's say, and also I think it acknowledges the fact that a part of the research has been has been wiped out, in a sense, as you were saying, or forced to go underground, or forced to be criminalized. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, I hadn't thought about it like the way that you like put it. So it's interesting to see that there's definitely different ways to interpret it.
Thank you.
So maybe that's anybody else?
Yeah, I had a question. Unfortunately, I have no video. Can you hear me?
I can, loud and clear. A voice.
Yes. Okay, great. Yeah. So thank you very much. That was really a treat to listen to, and to hear some alternative viewpoints on this. Like you said, the dominant narrative about the history of psychedelics. So I had a question about another one of these narratives, namely that the use of psychedelics is kind of strongly associated with leftism and progressive ideas. And in recent years, there's been some news media and coverage about the far right and conservative movements using psychedelics. The best example perhaps being the QAnon shaman, during the Capitol insurrection. And I was just wondering, did you anywhere in your research encounter examples of this being the case earlier? Because this is being presented as a completely new thing.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you encountered evidence that this might have been the case earlier. Yeah. Yeah,
that's the great part about doing research into stuff that really few people have looked at. Acid culture has been intertwined with extreme right-wing, ultra right-wing interests and movements from the very start. We could go all the way back to Ernst Jünger and the initial circle around Hoffman. Far from liberals, let me tell you. Extreme conservatives. So from the very start, there has been an extreme conservative thread here. And you can really trace that. You can do a best of. And the only reason people think psychedelics is left-wing is because they haven't done the research. And they're just looking at master narratives that appeared in journalistic accounts in the 70s. I'm thinking of Martin Lee's Acid Dreams and Jay Stevens' Storming Heaven. Both great texts, but they're journalists, so they weren't doing the heavy research. But if you look, for example, in the milieu, I looked at the 1980s, there was a huge push by, we'll call it industrial culture. I'm thinking of Adam Parfrey's Apocalypse Culture. I'm thinking of the Manson Renaissance that included Feral House. There was always this flirtation with Manson. Charles Manson himself represents, I think, a racialized race hatred theory of psychedelic culture, a race hatred theory of psychedelicism. So conservatives have been there from the very giddy up. And it's just, I think, journalists have been troubled to accept that because it's hard to explain. Aren't these supposed to make you love and peace? No, they're far more unwieldy than that. But thank you for your question. I should mention my friend's book, Strange Bedfellows by Alan Piper. Alan Piper wrote a really fun book going across right-wing psychedelic culture. So let me plug Alan Piper's book.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I believe there is some research being done, I think among others by Robin Carhart Harris, about psychedelics and political beliefs. And there's some indications that they might increase, at least temporarily, the trait openness, which is, associated with progressive ideas and stuff. But there's also a lot of evidence now pointing in the direction that it might even harden existing political beliefs and not so much change political beliefs. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting part of history that might also not be, might be overlooked as well. So thank you.
Oh, sure, thank you. Paloma, I saw you raise your hand. Yeah, what's up?
Hi, Christian. So I just graduated from my research master in religious studies at the UvA.
Hey.
Unfortunately, we didn't meet, but yeah, we come from sort of the same group of scholars. And my question is, you talked about psychedelic churches, and I wonder how they were using psychedelics sacramentally. I mean, did they have like a special ritual? Did they have like special sort of set and setting, or how did they go about all this?
Yeah, well, as I said, there was that spectrum, and I think Leary's liturgical approach, and he was very open about this. Actually, something that all the psychedelic churches share is religion. Who needs religion? We are so far beyond that. Religion is, in fact, not religious enough for what we're doing. Religion is phony. Religion is hierarchy, patriarchy, and sexual economic exploitation. We're more religion than religion. However, for the normals to be able to appreciate that, we have to come on as religion. And part of that come on was both a legal defense, because once we get busted, because it's going to happen, we have to be able to go in front of a jury of our peers, not really our peers, but, and go, hey, look, we have a book, we have, and of course, what they mean by religion, Protestantism. Often that's the big joke in religious studies. When you use the term religion, what you just mean is Protestant structures. And so when they said, oh, we're a religion, a lot of that liturgy was a legal defense. But there's also this other idea of like, listen, this is a highly reactive compound. And particularly on the Leary end, Leary, Neo-American Church, these type of religions really did insist on this is dangerous, and we really want to make sure we can take as many people as possible on a healing mystical trip. And to do that, Leary had specific protocols in place. Often, you know, you read these wonderful accounts of life at Millbrook. My favorite, of course, is Millbrook by Art Klepps, a hilarious book, because Art Klepps was a drunk who really wouldn't get on Leary's tip, but people would come down in white robes, you'd sit in the circle, they'd bring, Diana de Prima, if we're talking about Leary's commune, would bring out the LSD in a chalice, and Alan Watts, he was also a member of Leary's circle. Let's not forget, he was an Anglican minister. Talk about smells and bells. So on the Leary end, they had all of the cool religious ceremonialism you could want. And then on the other end, you had someone like Ken Kesey be like, you know, all that ritual shit makes it worse. You know, all that ritual shit is just like asking for a bad time. He's like, the way we shouldn't be reconfiguring ourselves to appeal to the masses. Our religion is more religious than religion. So to hell with all of those books and bells, and what we need is authenticity, and authenticity means total freak out. But that leads to another question that I think I saw in the chat, which is how come I didn't mention the Native American church? If you remember at the beginning, I said I'm going to be talking about psychedelicist ideology, which is a theory of naturalism. What do I mean by that? They believe that your mind is not that thing in here, but your mind is transmitted. And in fact, you can emphasize, you can augment that transmission. So it's a theory that goes back to psychical research. Anyways, the Native American church did not project a psychedelic theory of the mind onto peyote. They had a totally different belief structure that they used. And in that way, I don't see them as part of this tradition. Now, a lot of crossways, a lot of blending going on. And there's a fantastic book called Hippies, Indians, and the Fight for Red Power that talks about the way in which hippies were very much appropriating, very much supporting, very much embroiled in the Native American church movement. But I think it's important to not glom them together, because there are questions of legitimacy, questions of tradition that I think deserve to be parsed out with respect to the Native American church, which, if you recall, has won a number. I'm thinking of US government versus Woody, I think was 64. The US government, in a very confusing ruling, determined that Native Americans could legally use peyote in their ceremonies, and that so-called white people, whatever that means, could not. The only reason is a disgusting logic of like blood. Like, for some reason, the red man can use this and white man, really disgusting stuff, but important historically. Did that get to your question, Paloma?
Yeah, I have a follow-up to that question. I wonder, because in my own research, I sort of analyze how a setting of a particular ceremony influences on the type of experience. I wonder if those two different sort of settings for having psychedelic spirituality were producing, in fact, different experiences, different ideologies, different sort of ways of understanding what a psychedelic experience is.
Well, yeah, I mean, the one group we have to mention here when it comes to shaping a psychedelic experience is the CIA. They tried this with MK Ultra. They were the earliest adopters of LSD as an agent of mind change, but they didn't want the good type of mind changed. They wanted to disfigure your memory. They wanted to use it as a truth serum against the Russians. This was a Cold War, remember? So they wanted to weaponize LSD as a means of interrogating enemy. Anyways, it proved to be impossible to control what anyone experienced when you did these things, though Leary got the closest by claiming set and setting, which to this day still represents the basis upon which the psychedelic ideology is based. But yeah, it proved to be incredibly difficult to control how people had their experiences. Cool. So let's do a stack here. I saw Corey's hand, I think I saw Connor's hand, and I think I saw a hand in the chat maybe not. But let's start with Corey and then Connor, if that's all right with everybody. And if you have a question, just hit it and then we'll just stack you.
Hi, thanks, Dr. Greer. My question kind of piggybacks on Paloma's last remark regarding, or yours regarding the militarized, or the military's use of these substances. And, you know, one of, in the title of your dissertation, it's Psychedelic Militancy. And so I'm wondering, do you comment on the military's use, or what was the activity of the military in the 80s? Is there anything, could you say something about that? If the military had any interesting operations, or?
I wish I knew. I mean, the thing is, only now are we getting books really elaborating the extent to which the military was invested in psychedelics. And that's just the declassified information that came out in the 80s and 90s. So I mean, as far as I can tell, the book that just came out, Poisoner in Chief. This is new. I haven't had time to read it, but it's only going through Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA, and mind control. And that's 50s. So we're not even close to the government data dump related to DARPA, which I know has investments in psychedelic culture. DARPA would be this giant military complex. So yeah, I have to say, it's scary to think that like MK Ultra, which was this like insane mind control program, was the 50s. What, you think that stopped? You know? They also had Operation Midnight, which they conducted in the Haight-Ashbury, where they would lure unsuspecting Johns to a safe house. And in two-way mirrors, I know this sounds like stupid spy movie stuff. Two-way mirrors, you had a bunch of CIA spooks on one side, and watch what would happen when prostitutes would unsuspectingly dose people off the street, and seeing what type of information they could glean in the hopes of using it in the Cold War. It was a nightmare. And according to a lot of accounts, this type of testing was discontinued in the early 1960s by virtue of the number of suicides that were occasioned by virtue of testing. Though, yeah, it's no secret that the military had a profound investment in this. And perhaps the psychedelic renaissance will see that return. Also, though, one final point, in terms of the military's interest in psychedelics, or what we could call the alteration of consciousness through drugs, would be the trials, the very successful trials that really pushed the entire legalization movement over the edge, which was the MDMA. The MDMA trials for veterans who are suffering from PTSD. Much like it was AIDS patients that really pushed cannabis over the line for legalization in the 90s in California, it was veterans in the 2000s who were reporting some type of alleviation of suffering by virtue of their MDMA therapy, which, I mean, yeah, impressive.
Wow, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for your question, Corey. So good to see you, man.
You too.
What's up, Connor?
Christian, you took the words out of my mouth. I literally was going to ask about ketamine in the contemporary adoption of the substance to sort of alter consciousness in relation to trauma, make soldiers better soldiers without PTSD. I was also wanting to ask about the movements outside of this zine culture underground, in sort of insulated within religious traditions themselves. For instance, like the Jewish renewal movement led by Rabbi Reb Zellman, who actually was part of the Leary movement and actually experimented with Leary at Millbrook, and then formed basically a new religious movement rooted in Judaism in a much more progressive form. So I just want to know about your thoughts in relation to those types of movements versus, say, like the underground, and how those might differ, say, to contemporary adoption by religious seekers in these communities themselves.
Oh, Connor, you know you're the expert on this, man. I mean, I look to you to give me the answer about this. Is a fascinating line of research, and I'm so excited for Connor to pursue it, to see his work. How psychedelicist groups outside, I mean, I don't even know if we could call these groups psychedelicists, insofar as they would not be emphasizing this enchanted theory of naturalism, this enchanted theory of the mind and what it can do, but instead would be emphasizing traditional Jewish wisdom and the way they negotiate these two knowledge sets. Yeah, Connor, I'm waiting for your book, so chop chop. But also I want to see the way in which the Jesus movement played a role in psychedelicist culture in the 1970s. The Jesus movement, of course, was hippies that for one reason or another, maybe it became too dangerous to continue doing their psychedelic yoga. Maybe they felt as though they were shown a way beyond it, whatever. But the hippie movement, the Jesus people movement, which eventually became the evangelical Christian right of the 80s. You know, let's not forget, these are the same people that today are flooding into QAnon. This is that other stream of psychedelic weirdness, or the New Age, for that matter. You know, so I just looked at this one little militant, you know, stream. But yeah, I think I'm super excited to see the way in which Republicans, you know, made use of these substances. And of course, yeah, yoga. Yeah, Rian, what's up? You're muted, my friend.
There you go. Yeah, the question, because of course your talk mainly focused on U.S. culture, U.S. Situated groups. But I have a bit of trouble understanding the exact size and I guess international relations of some of these groups, where there's more like communities within the US, or was it like nationwide, or would they have like connections with international groups as well? You mentioned some influences in later international movements, but I wasn't sure what some of these original groups would be interested.
Yeah, well, of course, I think this goes for all questions. I think the person asking the question knows far more about these topics than I do, so I'll just give my 2 cents and then invite you to respond. But one of the major internationalization, the internationalization of the psychedelic movement happened before there was even a psychedelicist movement. You know, if you look in the United States, it was really Time magazine's coverage of the Summer of Love in 1967 that really introduced this idea that hippies exist into the general population. Before that, it was a grassroots street level culture, and they didn't call themselves hippies. You know, that was an invention by the media to whip up interest in selling Beatles records and bell bottoms. Should be treated as a separate phenomenon, or at least a symbiotic phenomenon, on what was ostensibly a spread, a saturation of this movement, whereby you don't need religion anymore to see God, which was a pretty phenomenal, I think, epoch-making device in history. Now, I should say that even before the media got a hold of it and created the hippie to sell bell bottoms, as early as 1964, 1965, you had enterprising bohemians take this LSD and psilocybin and DMT through what's called the Overland Passage, which was you could get a ship ticket from leaving from New York, arriving in Paris for cheap if you were willing to spend a month on board, and then you would walk to India. Now, of course, not everyone made it to India, and in fact, there's a fantastic history of this. It's a book called Orange Sunshine, and it talks about the largest LSD ring ever, which was the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. And in fact, it's their attempt to walk to India. And oftentimes they stopped in Afghanistan, very different place back. They stopped in Iran, very different place back then. And what you had was an international psychedelicist culture that, in fact, exists to this day as permanent features of international geography. Think of Goa. Goa was founded by a lot of these hippies that walked there, or whatever, you know. Maybe they took some flights. But, and Goa's not the only one. We could look at Ibiza in Spain. Anyways, I've always, I remember I was in Paris last summer with my partner, scouring the National Library for psychedelism, psychedelicism, and there are a few texts. And there are even a few groups in Paris that published fanzines in the 70s about psychedelic culture. Germany as well. I know in the Dutch scene, I mean, the cool thing about the Dutch scene is when I lived there, I could go and visit these people. A lot of them live at Rauhort. You know, you just have to go up the road and be like, hey, what were you doing in the 60s? They'll elaborate this. Oh, well, there was, of course, the Kabutters. There was, oh, you could go to the Institute of Social History and look at Simon Vinkenau's archive. And there you would unearth the dozens of psychedelic churches native to Amsterdam that no one's talked about. In fact, I think we just got a book about the provost like 5 years ago. And they were huge. You know, the Dutch provocateurs actually had a branch in Berkeley and a branch in New York. So I want to see histories not about the exporting of American psychedelicism, but the importing of other radical movements into America from abroad. I think we really need to have that conversation, not just the Americanization, but the the Indianification with respect to yoga coming over and Raj music. I mean, I want to see that international conversation go on, because I am pretty sick of this exclusivist, as I mentioned, white male history, particularly this idea that, because let's be clear, these psychedelic heroes from the 60s were all participating in the age-old American exceptionalism that defined every generation before them. We have the acid, we have the key, we're the messiahs, and we'll give it to you. You know, that's the same old colonial song, and it's somewhat problematic, it's boring, whatever. So yeah, I want to see that master narrative complicated. Also, I want to find Asian American psychedelic milieus, and that's really been on my radar. But I haven't come up with something, but I'll make sure to report back if I do.
Awesome.
Oh, I should mention that if any of this is absolutely fascinating to you and you really want to get deeper, I'm teaching a summer school course with the University of Amsterdam this summer. It's called Visions of the Occult. And we'll be talking about all this stuff, but also this lecture maybe misrepresented psychedelic culture, because psychedelic culture didn't arise ex nihilo. It wasn't like Leary took acid and was like, I have founded a movement. No, this is very much a phase in the longer development of esotericism, or what we could call occultism. Very much recycling many of the ideas that had been circulating for hundreds of years, well, roughly, let's say, since modernity, with the invention of modernity. So reincarnation, pacifism, vegetarianism, nudism, free love, psychical ideas of the mind, UFOs, blah, blah, blah. All of this has a longer history, and it just turns technicolor with the influx of LSD. And as Graham St. John has shown, DMT, very much the forgotten stepsister in this story, but certainly important. And there's a new book on mescaline as well. So let's not participate in this misperception that it was just all acid all the time. In my opinion, in fact, in my book, which is now contracted for publication, I'm happy to say, I make the point that it wasn't LSD that has floated this movement. It's the kind cannabis sativa that has really, I think, supported the dissemination and inflation of psychedelic culture by virtue of the fact that people use it every day. That many of the main figures in this movement use that far more regularly, and it's played a far more important role in their lives than LSD has. Yeah, as Yassine said, gateway drug, but in a good way.
Thank you. Kristen, do we have any more questions? All right.
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
Yassine, what's up?
Not much. Great lecture, Christian. I'm glad I got to hear your ideas a little bit more fleshed out this time. I was kind of curious, you brought up earlier about about how people, like Church of the Subgenius were like, what we're doing is like beyond religion, but religion's the best word for it, whatever. I've seen online a lot of times they get referred to as a parody religion, and people associated with it kind of think of Subgenius as mocking the very idea of religion. So, but I mean, from your lecture, it's clear that like bringing kind of like a religious studies lens, whatever that really means, but however you're using it, is actually really productive here. So, it seems like there's kind of an interesting, not contradiction, but like something funny happening by saying it's a religion that's not a religion, but calling it a religion brings out these useful insights. But by doing so, we're almost denying what the very people we're studying were saying about themselves. So I'm kind of curious about, I don't know, how useful that word is to what you're doing here, or versus
thank you for the question, man. Yeah, I mean, this is the question. It's almost like I planted him in the audience to ask him that question. I mean, that's how much I love this, because this is the huge debate that scholars from religious studies have been like, oh, nice dissertation, Subgenius, seen it, parody religion, or invented religion, or there's all these ways to get around the fact that, no, this is just a religion. However, these are hipsters. And if we know the one defining feature of the hipster is being hip to things, knowing that they don't know. So the only way you can be authentic in this milieu is what they call capping the squares, is to perform religion in a way that looks authentic to the outsiders, what they would call the glorps, the Kens and Barbies. So the only way to be authentic is to have a religion that looks inauthentic, because earnestness is so lame. Earnestness isn't funny. Earnestness does not represent the asymmetrical consciousness, the gnosis, if you will, that separates the hipster from the square. So my argument is, nope, nothing special, normal old religion, but in a different key, so to speak, the key of hip. So what do they say? Fuck them if they can't take a joke. It's the Church of the Subgenius motto, which I think is probably the hippest thing I've heard in a long time. I can think of no better way to end a lecture than with that.